The laughter started before he even set down the toolbox. It was a Thursday morning in late October, and the kind of cold that comes off Lake Michigan had already settled into the bones of the city. The Meridian Health Group occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Michigan Avenue, and on the 14th floor, the surgical wing's administrative level, a meeting had been underway for nearly 40 minutes. Leonard Hale had been called up from the facilities department to check a recurring fault in the OR backup power relay. It was not a glamorous assignment. It was never a glamorous assignment. But the flagged twice in the past month, and the hospital's compliance officer had finally pushed the issue up to someone who would actually do something about it. And that someone had called Leonard. He was 51 years old. He wore the gray uniform of the facilities staff, the kind that had his first name embroidered over the chest pocket in thread that had faded from repeated washing. He carried a metal diagnostic case in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and when he pushed open the door to the junction room adjacent to the surgical conference suite, the door swung wider than he'd intended, and he could see, through the open interior partition, the people seated at the long table. There were 8 of them. Dr. Priya Ashworth at the head, the hospital's chief of surgery, recently appointed and known for running meetings the way she ran her OR, precisely, without sentiment and slightly ahead of schedule. Beside her sat 3 attending physicians, 2 representatives from the hospital's medical devices vendor, and at the far end, Dr. Justin Mercer, 34 years old, 2 years out of his residency, and already regarded in certain circles as someone who was going places. Leonard did not look at any of them for long. He set his toolbox down quietly, opened his diagnostic case, and crouched beside the relay panel in the junction room. "Sorry," he said without looking up. "I'll be out of your way." He hadn't been speaking to anyone in particular. He was already focused on the panel. But Justin Mercer had seen him come in. Justin Mercer looked at the name on the pocket of the gray uniform. He looked at the toolbox. He looked at the diagnostic case with its worn latches. And then he leaned slightly toward the physician beside him. Dr. Ashworth was speaking and did not pause, and said, quietly enough that it carried only to the people nearest him and perhaps into the junction room, "Does he actually understand what we're talking about in here?" The physician beside him didn't respond. One of the vendor representatives smiled briefly and looked away. Leonard heard it. He had good ears. He had always had good ears, something his daughter liked to complain about whenever she thought she was being quiet. He did not look up. He continued reading the panel. His daughter's name was Abby. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, dark brown and steady, and somehow older than the rest of her face. Her mother, Renata, had died 4 years ago, an aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon when Abby was in kindergarten, and Leonard was in the basement of a building on the north side, rewiring a circuit board for a building management system. He had gotten the call at 3:47 in the afternoon, and he had not fully understood it, not really, not the way you understand things that happen slowly. They had been together since Leonard was 26. She had been the one who laughed at his jokes before he finished them and the one who insisted on keeping a plant in every room of the apartment despite the fact that neither of them had any reliable talent for keeping things alive. After she died, he threw out all the plants except one, a small succulent on the kitchen windowsill that she had named Gerald, and Gerald had somehow continued to exist, unchanged and unbothered, through everything that followed. Leonard had raised Abby alone since then. He worked days, and sometimes nights when the hospital had a critical system issue, and Abby went to school 2 blocks from their apartment, and on weekends she helped him cook, and complained that he didn't know any good music, and sat with him on the couch, watching nature documentaries that she pretended not to enjoy, but always finished. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois. He had spent 11 years as a senior systems engineer for a medical technology firm before a restructuring eliminated his entire department. And he found himself at 44 in a job market that had changed significantly while he wasn't paying attention. He had taken the facilities position at Meridian because it paid reliably, because the hours were predictable, and because Abby was 5 years old and needed a father who came home. He had never mentioned the degree to anyone at the hospital. It had not come up. The relay fault was more serious than the work order had indicated. Leonard traced it through 2 subsidiary panels before he found the source. A voltage regulator that had been installed incorrectly during a renovation 3 years prior, creating an intermittent fault that would, under peak surgical load, cause a 1.4-second delay in backup power transfer. In an OR, 1.4 seconds was not a trivial number. In an OR running on backup during a power event, 1.4 seconds could mean something. He documented everything on his clipboard. He photographed the panel with his phone. He wrote up the fault in precise language. Fault location, probable cause, risk classification, recommended remediation, and he did it quietly in the junction room while the meeting in the conference suite continued on the other side of the partition. He had been there about 40 minutes when the meeting shifted. He heard it before he understood it. A change in the register of voices. The vendor representative speaking more quickly. Dr. Ashworth's tone going flat in the particular way it did when something had not gone as planned. The system ran diagnostics at 6 this morning, one of the vendor representatives was saying. Everything was within normal parameters. That's not what I'm seeing on my end, said a voice Leonard didn't recognize. Could be a calibration issue with the reporting interface. Or it could be the system, Dr. Ashworth said. The vendor representatives were from Vantas Medical Systems. They were there to present the final certification for the hospital's new integrated surgical monitoring platform, a system that would go live across all 4 ORs in 6 weeks. It was the most significant capital investment Meridian had made in a decade. The board had been briefed, the surgical staff had been trained, the rollout had a date, and now, apparently, something in the certification data wasn't matching what the hospital's own internal diagnostics were showing. Leonard kept his head down and continued writing. The discrepancy is in the power load tolerance data, Dr. Ashworth said. Our facilities team ran an independent load assessment last month. The numbers don't align. We'd need to see that assessment too. I have it here. A pause. These figures suggest the system may not maintain signal integrity under peak or load conditions. That's not a minor issue, Dr. Ashworth. I want to be very clear. Our testing was conducted under. I understand that, she said. I'm telling you what our data shows. Leonard set his pen down. He had done that load assessment. In September, he had spent 2 days running power measurements through every OR in the hospital. Measuring draw at peak usage, calculating tolerances, documenting the load curves during the busiest surgical windows of the week. He had written it up in a 20-page technical report that he had submitted to the compliance office and never heard about again. He had assumed it had gone to a file somewhere. He had not imagined it would end up on Dr. Ashworth's table in the context of a multi-million-dollar system certification. He looked at the partition. Through the gap he could see the edge of the conference table, a water glass, the corner of a document someone was holding. He looked back at his clipboard. He did not move for a long moment. What happened next was something Leonard would try to explain to Abby later, in the way he always tried to explain things to her that were complicated, not simplified, because she didn't like to be simplified, but translated, made into something that kept all the important parts. What he said to her was, sometimes you know something that somebody in the room needs to know, and you have a choice about whether you say it or whether you stay quiet. And the reason you might stay quiet isn't because you're afraid. It's because you're not sure it's your place, and then you have to decide if that's a good reason or just a comfortable one. Abby had looked at him for a moment and then said, "What did you do?" He had told her he knocked on the partition. He knocked on the partition. "Excuse me," he said. The room went quiet. 8 faces turned toward him, The man in the gray uniform crouching beside a doorframe holding a clipboard. Dr. Ashworth looked at him. Her expression was not unfriendly, it was simply careful. "Can I help you? I think I may be able to," Leonard said. "I'm from facilities. I did the load assessment you're referencing. A beat." "You wrote that report?" One of the vendor representatives said. "Yes." Justin Mercer, from the far end of the table, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite dismissal, but was somewhere in between. Dr. Ashworth did not look at Justin Mercer. "Come in," she said. Leonard Hale stood at the conference table and opened his clipboard to the section that contained his raw measurement data, the figures he had collected over 2 days in September, handwritten in columns, each one dated and time-stamped, because that was how he had been trained, and old habits were reliable in ways that shortcuts were not. The Vantas representative, a man named Craig, mid-40s, the kind of careful confidence that comes from defending expensive products in rooms full of skeptical people, asked him to explain his methodology. Leonard explained it. He explained it clearly, without defensiveness, in the same level tone he used when he was explaining a fault to an apprentice technician. He described the measurement protocol, the equipment he'd used, the timing of the tests relative to peak OR activity. He pointed to specific figures on his own data and showed where they diverged from the manufacturer's tolerance specifications. Craig asked a follow-up question about the load measurement intervals. Leonard answered it. Craig asked another question, this one more technical, about voltage variance, thresholds under concurrent device load. Leonard answered that one too. The room had gone very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the conversation has become more serious than anyone expected. "Where did you?" Craig started, and then seemed to catch himself mid-question. "The load variance you're seeing in the Vantas data," Leonard said, "is because their testing protocol used staggered device initialization. When you initialize surgical devices in sequence rather than concurrently, you don't capture the peak simultaneous load. In an actual OR environment, you have anesthesia equipment, monitoring arrays, and surgical tools coming online within the same 2-minute window. That's what my measurements reflect." Dr. Ashworth was looking at the 2 sets of data side by side. Craig looked at his colleague, a younger woman who had not spoken much, and who was now looking at her own laptop with an expression that suggested she's checking something she wished she had checked earlier. "He's right," she said quietly. Craig said nothing for a moment. "If the system is installed and certified based on staggered initialization data," Leonard continued, "and then it's run under actual concurrent load, you're looking at a potential signal integrity issue in the monitoring array. Depending on the surgical circumstance, that could mean, I understand what it could mean," Dr. Ashworth said. The room was silent for a count of 5. "How long would it take to rerun the testing with concurrent initialization?" she asked Craig. Craig looked like a man doing several calculations at once. 3 weeks, minimum. The surgical platform rollout date was in 6 weeks. "Then we have 3 weeks, Dr. Ashworth said. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Leonard picked up his toolbox and his diagnostic case. He had a fault report to finish and a work order to close, and 3 other jobs on his schedule for the afternoon. He was in the hallway heading toward the elevator when he heard footsteps behind him. "Hey!" He turned. Dr. Ashworth was standing a few feet away, her tablet under one arm, her ID badge catching the light. "That report you wrote," she said. "It's good work. Thank you. Did you have a—" She paused, choosing words. "What's your background?" "Electrical engineering," Leonard said. "Systems." Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the look people had sometimes when a category they'd been using turned out not to fit. "I didn't see any professional credentials listed in the report," she said. "The report was submitted through the compliance office. They have my personnel file." "I see." A pause. "Would you be willing to consult on the retesting? Formally. I want someone from our side in the room when Vantas runs their revised protocol." Leonard thought about his afternoon schedule. He thought about the other 3 jobs. He thought about the voltage regulator he still needed to document, and the report he needed to file before end of day. "Yes," he said. Dr. Ashworth nodded. "I'll have someone from my office contact HR." She turned to go, then stopped. "That was a difficult room to speak up in," she said. Without turning around, "I noticed." Then she was gone. The retesting took 3 weeks and 2 days. During that time, Leonard was assigned formally, still in his facilities role, but with a consultation designation attached to his work order, to sit in on the Vantis recertification process. He reviewed their revised testing protocol and suggested 2 additional measurement scenarios that Craig's team had not included. Craig, to his credit, included them without argument, in the manner of someone who has stopped trying to win a point he has already lost and would prefer to simply do the thing correctly. The revised testing confirmed Leonard's original assessment. Under concurrent device load, the system's signal integrity dropped below the acceptable threshold for continuous monitoring in high-acuity procedures. Vantis had to redesign a component of the power management module before the system could be cleared. The rollout was delayed 8 weeks, not 6. The board was informed. The chief medical officer sent a memo to the department heads. Somewhere in that memo, in a subordinate clause, there was a reference to a technical discrepancy identified during internal review. Leonard read the memo in the break room one afternoon between jobs. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner since morning and thought it was a reasonable description of what had happened. He had not thought about Justin Mercer's comment again. That wasn't entirely true. He had thought about it once, briefly, the way you think about something that made a small mark and then becomes less interesting than the work in front of you. What he thought was, that kind of comment usually says more about the room a person has been in than about the person they're looking at. Justin Mercer had spent 10 years in rooms where the hierarchy was visible in the clothes and the credentials and the way people sat at tables. It wasn't an excuse. It was just a fact that Leonard had encountered enough times to have filed it somewhere without much additional commentary. What had stayed with him longer was the question Dr. Ashworth had asked. Not about his background, but the observation before she left. That was a difficult room to speak up in. He had turned that over a few times during the weeks that followed. Not because it had been difficult exactly, it had been uncertain. There was a difference. Difficult implied cost. Uncertain implied a question about whether the cost was his to pay, and he had decided, crouched beside the partition with a clipboard in his hand, that it was. On a Friday evening in mid-December, 6 weeks after the retesting concluded, and the new rollout date was confirmed, Leonard picked Abby up from school, and they walked home through the first real snow of the season. It was the kind of snow that came down slowly and covered everything with a layer of quiet. Abby had her hood up and was walking in the way she did when she was thinking, slightly ahead of him, slightly slower than her usual pace, her boots leaving careful prints in the white. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, if you knew something important and you didn't say it, and then something bad happened, would that be your fault?" Leonard walked for a moment without answering. "What would make it your fault?" he said. "Would be if you stayed quiet because you were afraid, or because you didn't want the trouble. If you stayed quiet because you genuinely believed it wasn't your call, that's different. But you have to be honest with yourself about which one it is. Because it's easy to convince yourself it isn't your call when really you just don't want the trouble." Abby considered this. How do you know which one you're doing? You ask yourself what you'd do if nobody was watching, if there was no trouble either way. He paused. If you'd still stay quiet then, maybe it really isn't your call. But usually when you ask that question, the answer comes pretty fast. Abby nodded, with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old who is deciding whether to file something under things I understand or things I'll understand later. "Did something happen at school?" Leonard asked. "Sort of." She pulled her hood tighter. "I'll tell you at dinner." She told him at dinner. It was not a large thing, A friend had said something untrue about another friend, and Abby had heard it, and she had to decide whether to say so. She had said so. It had not gone smoothly, and there were now some complicated feelings at the lunch table that she was navigating with the careful precision of someone diffusing something that might or might not actually be dangerous. Leonard listened to all of it. He did not rush the telling. He asked one question when she was done. "Do you think you did the right thing?" "I think so. It was the true thing," Abby said. "It was the true— Those are usually the same," he said. "Usually," she said, and gave him the look she had inherited directly from her mother, the one that suggested she was at least 3 steps ahead of the conversations and was being patient about it. After dinner, she helped him wash the dishes, and they talked about something else entirely. A documentary she wanted to watch about the deep ocean, and the particular category of terrifying creatures that lived in places with no light, and how strange it was that anything could exist in the dark like that, just going about its life, entirely unbothered by the fact that nobody up here knew it was there. "How do they know where they're going?" Abby asked. Leonard handed her a wet bowl to dry. He thought about it for a moment. "They know their environment," he said. "They just know it in a way that doesn't look like knowing from the outside." Abby considered this, turning the bowl over in the dish towel. "That's kind of like you," she said. Not accusingly, not admiringly, just observationally, the way she said most things. Leonard put the last pan on the drying rack and turned off the faucet. "I guess it is," he said. He had one more conversation about that Thursday in October. It came in January, on a morning when he had arrived early to run a maintenance check on the backup generators and found Dr. Ashworth already in the building, coffee in hand, reading something on her tablet in the corridor outside the generator room. She had told him that the Vantas system had received final certification the previous week, that the revised rollout was on schedule, that the Vantas project lead, not Craig, a more senior figure, had sent a formal letter acknowledging the testing methodology gap and the role that Meridian's internal assessment had played in catching it before installation. "The letter mentions the facilities department," she said. "That's appropriate," Leonard said. "I put in a request to HR," she said, "about reclassifying your role." Leonard looked at her. "I don't know what will come of it," she said. "HR has its own timeline. But I thought you should know I did it. Thank you." She looked at him for a moment. "How long have you been in facilities?" 7 years. She nodded slowly. The kind of nod that isn't agreement with something said, but acknowledgement of something understood. "The hospital is lucky the report landed on my desk instead of someone else's," she said. Leonard thought of the report sitting in the compliance office, of the months it had existed in a file folder before it became relevant, of all the things that had to line up in a particular way for a Thursday morning maintenance call to intersect with a certification meeting. "I think about that sometimes," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, and then she looked down at her tablet and said she had to be upstairs, and Leonard went into the generator room and began his check. The generators were running well. Everything was within normal parameters. He worked through the checklist methodically, the way he always did, in the quiet hum of machines that most people in the building never thought about. Machines that existed entirely in the background, steady and unrecognized, waiting for the moment when the lights went out, and everything that had been invisible became the only thing that mattered. He finished the check, signed the log, and went to get his first cup of coffee of the day. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, snow was coming down again over the city, slow and even, covering everything quietly, the way it always did.